This is the Requiem Metal Podcast, episode 23, Carcass. This episode brought to you by Earache Records. Visit earache.com for all the music you're about to hear on this program. Also, coming November 11th, Order of a Need. Welcome to a night of carnage with some choice cuts. You just heard there was Genital Grinder and Maggot Colony.
Yes.
So this is the Requiem Metal Podcast Carcass Edition. I'm Mark Rudolph.
And I'm Jason Hundy. And appropriately enough, we just got back from pig roast not too long back. Eating some pig carcass.
The vegetarian members of the Carcass would be pretty upset at us.
Yeah,
about that.
I know.
Hey, it's okay.
I know. Sorry, we broke the carcass rule. I've been watching a lot of Dexter this week, too. So, carving up human bodies and all kinds of stuff. So it's very appropriate. I'm glad to be here. Genital Grinder, Maggot Colony, kind of a couple fun choices there.
Yeah.
Genital Grinder, of course, was the instrumental that got things sort of kicking, and then Maggot Colony is just a wild orgy of drums and
those are both off the Reek Putrefaction debut from 1988, which can also be found on Choice Cuts.
Yeah, that's the opener of Choice Cuts as well.
Kind of a best of that Earache put out, 3 years ago maybe?
I think it may have been longer, 2004, 4 years ago, so close. But we were just talking about kind of reflecting on, Reek Putrefaction, the debut from Carcass. And
John Peel's favorite record in 1988.
Yeah, that's what we were sort of saying, and it's still infinitely more listenable than some of the older Napalm stuff in some ways.
And
it's
for
got
the time,
it's got some dynamicism too.
Nothing else was like that. I mean, that was just like nobody'd record anything like that to tape.
Yeah, and it wasn't. And the thing about the early stuff with Carcass too is it wasn't just the music; it was everything. It was the aesthetic.
Yeah, I mean, it was the insane lyrics that you had no idea
the medical lyrics.
Yeah,
about the song titles. I mean, that you knew there was something there. These guys weren't totally insane, but it was so clouded in mystery, almost like as to what the motive of these guys was.
Yeah, I was talking with Chris, our sometimes collaborator, And I think my first entry into Carcass was with Necroticism, and they used to cover it a lot in like Thrasher magazine, the skateboard magazine. Mm-hmm. So I don't remember we heard a lot about it through that, where there's all this mysticism around these supposedly 3 doctors, from where they're from, Liverpool.
Yeah. Yep. Liverpool.
These 3 doctors that were putting together this crazy music, and that kind of perpetuated that myth for a while. But
and actually, I had heard the first thing and there's going to be a couple stories that deal with a couple of characters that I ran cross country with, Andy Zimmer and Rob Moylan. And I know Andy actually listens to our podcast quite a bit. And actually, Rob's brother should be listening to our podcast. He'd probably enjoy it. But they were they were the first to know a little bit about some of the older Carcass stuff, and they would always tell me rumors that supposedly these guys were med students and were just like out of their minds.
The truth comes out that like Jeff Walker's sister had a nursing book.
Exactly.
Or something. So
and they also told me other rumors, which I'll get into later when we get to Symphonies of Sickness and stuff. But
with Reek, I mean, we've got basically a collage of human meat.
And of course, if you don't know what I don't know if you call it a joke or the political statement or whatever. It's, Carcass were avid, vegans and vegetarians. Mm-hmm. And so this was sort of it
was like, what's the difference between this and slaughtering, animal flesh kind of thing. So, I mean, it had more of a social message. It wasn't just about, shock value, I guess, at the time. So I could see why people might have glommed onto him as more of a serious, act.
Sure. And I bet, guys like John Peel are smart enough to know that these guys were not just a flash in the pan, that they were up to something kind of ingenious that had never been done before in music. And he, of course, had already been familiar with, grindcore and Napalm Death and some of the stuff that was kind of coming out of the
And we should mention
scene,
that Bill Steer was in Napalm Death was he on Scum or was he on Enslavement?
He's on both.
Is he on both?
Whoa. I know he's on from Enslavement.
Okay.
For sure, with Lee Dorian.
But you look at...
Because I think Broderick played guitar on the first side of Scum, and Steer may have played on side B, possibly. That's bad that I don't know that.
Just look at what Napalm did, and then what Carcass did, and how much of a jump that was in like musicianship and just dynamicism of music. It wasn't just like crazy blast beats constantly. They like broke it up a lot, and it actually had like catchy parts to it. Mm-hmm. Tell the guys kind of knew what they were doing.
And it's hard to even like find some of the Celtic Frost, metal influence in Carcass. Like it's so obvious in the early Napalm Death. I mean, it's almost there in kind of every riff, especially on Scum.
Every breakdown,
But this was something completely new that, again, you had no idea where the influence was coming from. Mm-hmm. Like what inspired these guys to write songs the way they did.
Yeah, and Walker came from, what was it, Electro Hippies? Like some kind of like, I guess, crust punk band or something, or Angro punk or something.
And obviously, punk is a huge influence. I mean, grindcore is nothing without punk, and I'm not going to...
even like the death metal version of the, the sing-song vocals with, Walker doing the more raspy, and then later Amat, but then, Steer and Amat both doing like the guttural vocals, like in response kind of thing. So.
And even on Reek and Symphonies, Ken Owens even threw some vocals in there as well. So... And at this point, Carcass is a 3-piece with on the first 2 records, Reek and Symphonies of Sickness. Mm-hmm. Ken Owens on drums, Jeff Walker on bass and vocals, mainly vocals. Mm-hmm. And Steer did a couple vocals, like you said, and then he's playing most of the guitar.
Yeah.
So, Mark and I, in honor of sort of a lot of things that have been happening, we try and be kind of timely with our podcast here, and Carcass is reunioned and reformed, just like At the Gates.
Not coming anywhere near us.
Yes, Jeff, if you're listening to this, or even Mike Hickey, if you're listening to this, please contact Jeff and let him know that we want a Midwestern show. I'll drive to Chicago. I'll drive to Cleveland.
It'd be cool, but hey,
it's hard to get in a car and get to Philly and New York. It's like a 10-hour drive, and
the last time I saw him was in '93 on the Heartwork tour.
And sad to say, I've never seen him. And that's the hardest part of knowing that they're out there right now, and that I can't get there to see these guys. They're like skipping the Midwest all completely. So maybe the response will be so forthcoming and
hopefully,
good that they'll
so overwhelming
they'll want to keep touring. So who knows? But Mark and I decided to get together because of the reunion, and also kind of coincides with the most recent issue of Decibel, which kind of gives a a basic history of almost every Carcass record, outside of Necroticism, which they had already done for
by
a
the
Hall
time
of
this
Fame.
comes out, it'll be 3 months old.
Yeah, that's true. But that kind of inspired us to say, hey, let's throw together a kind of a Carcass show, but we'll do it sort of chronologically in a way, but in terms of the track selection, Mark sat down and kind of picked out 6 songs that he liked, and I picked 6 songs, so there's no
and
kind
it's tough to,
rhyme or
it's not
reason.
like these are the quintessential tracks. It's
No, we're leaving
almost
out
impossible.
We're leaving out the big hits, kind of in a way. But we played Corporal Jigsaw Quandary back when we did the show with Albert a couple months ago.
Choosing Death one.
Yeah, and so people can hear that, and most people have probably heard No Love Lost and Heartwork several times.
I'm sure a lot of people are familiar. So a lot of the stuff we did pick is some older. I mean, we've got a fair amount. Probably about half of the stuff is off of Symphonies and Reek, or the Tools of the Trade EP.
Yeah. And so, we just, hope that you enjoy. If you're already familiar with Carcass, then just enjoy the ride, I guess. Maybe we'll play some old songs you haven't heard for a long time. And if you haven't heard Carcass, then this is definitely one of the biggies to get on board with. I mean, Carcass is absolutely essential. They're right up there in probably Mark and I's opinion with, Opeth, Catatonia, At the Gates, Dark Tranquility, My Dying Bride, Anathema, just this.
They'd probably be like my number
Paradise
3
Lost,
all time.
really number 3. I know they're my top 5. I'd have to really think about the rankings, but certainly out of England, they're probably number 1 or number 2, right up there with Anathema for me.
Yeah, probably them, Paradise Lost, and both are probably in my top 3. Couldn't necessarily make a number 1 out of that. But
yeah, it's tough. The 3 different styles. They're all doing completely different stuff.
Anybody asks you what's your favorite band, I just roll my eyes and I'm like,
what are you in the mood
see
for?
my CD collection?
What are you in the mood for? So, but it's certainly Carcass near and dear, and that's what's so disappointing about not being able to get over to see them. But if you are living on the West or the East Coast, get out there and see them, because this might be the only time. I mean, really, they're fickle gentlemen, so they might not put
plus they're dealing with Mike Amott being in a super successful band, Arch Enemy, and
Bill Steers doing his band,
Firebird,
and
Ken Owen about 3-4 years ago.
Actually, it was about 99.
Was it 99?
Yeah,
so almost 10 years ago. Brain aneurysm. He's been almost out of commission, but he is. I mean, as a tribute to him, they're actually splitting, and they talk about this in the newest Decibel, but they're actually splitting the profits with him as a fair share, which I think is super cool and kind of a testament to those guys. They've always seemed like they've been really straight with each other, and they've never had any kind of pretense to what they do.
And kind of in honor of the reunion and all this other stuff, Earache has recently kind of put out new versions of their records. Fourth time for some of these.
And I'm a sucker that's bought every one of them.
Well, and lucky for Earache, in order to sucker people like us into it, they threw on some nice DVDs, kind of interview features.
Even
and
on
stuff.
the Heartwork album, they've got an entire different version of the record, which is kind of nice. But
so it's kind of cool. It's a good time to be a Carcass fan. That's for sure. And so we thought it's definitely the appropriate time to kind of throw our hats into the ring and finally do a Carcass show. Yeah,
and if you're looking for any kind of exhaustive history, I definitely go check out Choosing Death, book by Albert Mudrian, excuse me.
And that's definitely one of the more essential things you're going to get that deals with it, as well as some of the stuff that is in Decibel.
Does Ian Christie go much into that in History of Heavy Metal at all?
I mean, Carcass is in there for sure. I can't remember how much detail.
Okay.
It's weird now, having read so many books on the history of metal. I can't remember which facts come from which book. They're sort of all kind of up in my head somewhere. But we're gonna get to a couple picks that you had from Symphonies. We'll do. We both had 2 songs that we each picked off of Symphonies, and kind of stacked up. That we'll listen to Mark's 2, and then we'll get into my 2, I guess. Tell us about the 2 that you picked.
I've got Reek of Putrefaction and Exhume to Consume. I think Reek is almost like the quintessential Carcass song. I mean, the first time I saw that Hard and Heavy grindcore special thing that's kind of infamous in the Metal Underground, where they interviewed a bunch of these bands, just that video of them having all these autopsy photos projected on top of them, and then seeing Jeff Walker looking like the Predator with his huge dreads and the effects on his vocals, and how catchy and epic the song was. I was just like, man, that is unreal.
And it starts Symphonies off with just that intro.
It's just
is that a sample? I've never been able to tell. Is that a sample from a horror movie or something like that? Whoa, I think we're slaughtering a cat too. Something dying in the background.
I mean, it's almost the same theme as Psycho, but it's just like, played on like a keyboard or something.
And then those eerie, like,
I think they're just, I used to have a keyboard that almost had like the kind of like chorus vocal thing put on it.
And then it goes into that, like,
that almost like vomit on the microphone screen.
And it's a total classic. And I was telling, Mark was saying that he thinks that the title of the record was kind of like just the alliteration kind of flow of Symphonies of Sickness. And I said there are times when I'm listening to that song in my car when I'm running. I used to rollerblade to Symphonies of Sickness a lot. I don't know why. Which is
a YouTube video.
Exactly. But I just remember like really like sometimes you'd have those headphone moments with this song, and I can almost picture like a conductor just the song starts just almost like layering different like musical elements, and then it's just like this cacophony of sound, and then it all of a sudden will like find like a melody. Yeah, and it kind of rides through, and it's a cool tune. I think
that and like Left Hand Path, those are two of like the most epic, like totally capture an era of like this kind of like extreme music.
And it's as cult as Reek was, I mean, Symphonies is like such a next level.
Oh, it's a huge progression. And I mean, I think I got Symphonies right after I got Necroticism, but it sat on my shelf forever. And then back in '96, I pulled it on and just listened to it like front to back, and I was like, this is a super, I mean, there's almost more going on in that record than's going on in Necroticism.
Yeah, Necroticism is stripped down in some ways and catchier.
Stripped down and refined, and they focus more on like, it's more traditional songwriting structures, I think.
And this is just like, I mean, it's grindcore, but it's also death metal, and it's also got just these just weird elements kind of happening all over the place. And, I don't know. It's a special record, and I think like you said, it speaks of an era. It's almost the introduction to like a whole new sound and a whole new possibility for extreme music.
Yeah,
much like Left Hand Path was sort of like the beginning of Swedish metal in a way.
Gothic from Paradise Lost.
Yeah, and just this, I remember. I mean, you could say even in modern times, like the opening of that first like Dillinger EP or something. I mean, or Converge, Jane Doe. I mean, just like. Comes out of nowhere and swoops down. This song and the Exhume to Consume were both on the Grind Crusher tape.
Yep.
Yeah, because when we talked about that in the Morbid Angel podcast, that was a tape I got a hold of at a pretty young age and was pretty influential on me. Symphonies was weird for a while because this record I used to try and borrow from my friend Rob when I ran cross country with him, and he would lend it to me, and I'd try and buy it off him all the time. But he kept telling me that he couldn't do that because his brother needed it and stuff. So I kind of have special memories of that, but I'll get into those a little bit later. So we're going to hear Reek and Exhume, and then we're going to round things out with one of my particular favorites from this record, Empathological Necroticism, which is kind of cool because it's the title of the next album in a way, Necroticism and stuff. So, but. Cool. Ready for a trio of Carcass symphony stuff?
Let's go.
Let's do it. Rock and roll.
It's
Alright, back.
Empathological necroticism. Say that 5 times fast. Exhume to consume and reek of putrefaction from Carcass's Symphonies of Sickness. And we're still kind of counting down our kind of personal favorites, you know, that were
our favorites at this point in time.
Favorites at the time. Yeah, this list could change in 2 weeks. But the next song we're kind of going to get into is from Symphonies as well, but it has sort of a special legendary story because when, as I mentioned before, when we used to borrow this record from Rob, I was probably like a freshman in high school, or maybe a sophomore, and we had just discovered Carcass Heartwork. And so, you know, we were kind of into the Heartwork sound, and Rob's like, "Oh, you got to hear this old Carcass thing, man. This is sweet." And he goes, "There's actually a song," and they would always talk about this song over and over again, Ruptured and Purulence. He goes, "There's actually a song where, like, I think he vomits at the beginning," and we're like, "No way, you know, no way." And he's like, "No, it's crazy. It's the craziest sound you'll ever hear, like, vocally." And so we'd borrow it, and sure enough, like, we just would go crazy for this song. And so I would always, like, play it for, like, girls and stuff. I'm like, "You want to hear, like, the sickest song in the world?" And so we constantly played, you know, Ruptured and Purulence, and it sort of became, like, this kind of legendary song for us. But the thing I remember the most about Reek and Symphonies was Jeff, Grindcore Coon, who's been on a couple of podcasts with us before. He and I got a hold of this history of heavy metal thing that I think Metal Maniacs put out like in 94, 95, and they devoted like 2 or 3 pages to each genre of music, like doom metal, grindcore, death metal, this sort of thing. And they talked about like Carcass records, and they said, you know, Heartwork is essential in necroticism, but Reek and Symphonies are sloppy and horrible and are avoidable. And so for years, mentally, like, I had like this like thing ingrained in me, like, that I you know, I'm not supposed to like Reek and Symphonies for some reason. And I don't know who, God only knows who wrote it. If it was, could have been Catherine Ludwig or some idiot like that used to be associated with that magazine. But you know, so it was really cool that I was able to finally get a hold of this record from my friend Rob, and it kind of like turned me on to the old style Carcass, and I really kind of grew in love with this. And in fact, I had this record long before I had Necroticism, strangely enough, which you guys had Necroticism before anything, so I'm coming at Carcass from totally different angles in many ways. So we're going to hear Ruptured and Purulence, and then we're also going to hear some stuff from Necroticism. And you were talking to Chris earlier about some of your Carcass history and stuff, and it started with Necroticism. What do you recall from that era, I guess?
I remember, I think Chris ended up picking up the CD first, and we were like, this was 1991. Mm-hmm. So I was like a sophomore in high school or junior in high school, I don't remember exactly, but going over to his tiny apartment that he was at with his mom, sitting on his bed and just listening to that thing over and over and over, like passing the booklet back and forth, just with how had all these anatomy like drawings on the inside, and then the lyrics were just like almost in another language. Mm-hmm. They didn't seem to make any sense at all. The solos were, had like their own. The
solos had their own like little like goofy titles and stuff. Yeah.
And just being like just amazed at how like it's seemingly how technical the thing was. It's going back now listening at it, it's really not that technical compared to like Necrophagist or something, but they were still thinking a lot about song structure. They were taking like grindcore to the kind of the next level.
Well, and especially like the song you picked out here, Pedigree, Butchery, going from like where Reek and Symphonies were, which sound like animals fighting in like a cage or something, to all of a sudden these acoustic like interludes and things that are sort of like layered underneath everything. And of course we need to say that Mike Amat is joined at this point. Yeah,
which and if you watch any of those Carcass DVDs that have basically they're the companion to those new re-releases, where he's talking about like they asked him to join at Reek, and he was like, nah, you guys kind of stink. I'm going to go start Carnage. And then
he really liked Symphonies.
He's like, wow, I kind of passed the buck on that.
Yeah. So you
came along in this record.
A second opportunity, which is cool. And it obviously worked out for all parties because Amat, contributed to two of the greatest, extreme metal records of all time. And then, of course, he got his launching pad to go do his own thing with Arch Enemy.
Yeah. Which is blown up bigger than probably Carcass ever were financially.
And it's worked out pretty well for him, I'd say. But Pedigree Butchery was a song you picked out, but I easily could have thrown my hat onto it, too.
Oh, sure. It's hard not... There's not really a clunker on Necroticism.
There's no song I hate of Carcass,
really.
Not that I can think of. Maybe there's a song on Reek that
there's
maybe I would want to listen to.
Forgettable stuff, minute and a half tracks on Reek that you could do without,
but anything on Necroticism, Heartwork, and Symphonies is completely memorable. But what was it that sort of these two songs in particular kind of drew your Well,
a lot of it is, we haven't mentioned Ken Owen too much, but he's if you look at any of the liner notes, he's always credited as one of the songwriters on any of the songs. And as much flack as he used to get back in the day for being a sloppy drummer, he like really incorporates himself into the songs more than just laying down a straight beat. He's accentuating, like, they'll have a guitar lick and then he'll like punctuate that with like a little drum fill or something. I think he's a really interesting drummer. He's maybe not a technically fantastic drummer, but he's really great at improvising and kind of working within his limitations, I think.
It's very organic.
And I think he really shines on both of those songs too.
Mm-hmm. And Incarnated Solvent Abuse was kind of a big, one of the first kind of big songs.
Like a single.
Yeah, because they had a video out, which you can find pretty easily on YouTube. And if I remember right, they're sort of like, are they using like plastic?
They've
over
got
their
like these rubber sheets that they're pushing their faces through and stuff, and like it's almost didn't a lot of it kind of mirror the photo session for the?
I think so.
It's been a while since I've seen that one, but
yeah, I remember watching in the last few months. Like I was just sort of surfing through YouTube because they had a bunch of live Carcass videos from this.
It's also
summer.
On the Wake Up Smell the Carcass DVD that's out on your end.
Yep. And I was jonesing to want to see what Carcass looked like live, and this incarnation. No pun intended. Incarnated Solvent Abuse kind of came on the YouTube click, and it's fun. It's a neat video. It was they probably weren't given much money by Earache at the point, but they sort of creatively did the coolest thing I think they could have with that concept. But these two songs are in particular, I think Incarnated Solvent Abuse is one of the more melodic, catchy sort of songs in terms of the solos and just the songwriting that I think they had ever done up until this point. It might be the catchiest song along with Jigsaw Quandary on Necroticism. So good choices indeed. So we're going to hear one of mine, Ruptured and Purulence, to start things off, and then a pair off Necroticism from Mark. We're going to hear Pedigree, Butchery, and Incarnated Solvent Abuse from Carcass.
You can hear people puking. I mean, they're dog meat.
If visible identification is not possible, the pathologist may be able to take fingerprints from the body, but if decay has set in, things become more complicated.
Incarnated Solvent Abuse, Pedigree Butchery, and of course the vomitous Ruptured and Purulence from Carcass here. Some of our personal choices, maybe not yours. If you have a particular Carcass song that you kind of wish we had played, let us know at requiempodcast@gmail.com. We're always kind of looking for as much feedback, which has been kind of cool lately. We've actually been getting a lot more emails and stuff.
Yeah.
And,
a couple people, in the industry, and writers and fellow journalists and stuff too. So it's kind of cool to hear that people actually dig this stuff.
Yeah, and it's nice to hear from old friends too, like people that like you said, in the industry, like back when we did Requiem or we did.
Yeah, we've had a couple of writers that actually worked on, or a writer that worked on Eclipse magazine. She sent a couple emails back and forth, and a couple of writers at Decibel as well. So yeah, it's been kind of nice.
Doing the thing with Decibel really kind of helped us out quite a bit in terms of spreading out to a wider fan base.
It really got. Because there's not a ton of places where you can really kind of peddle the stuff out there where people really care that much, but the Decibel forum was pretty huge to get us some recognition for sure, so we appreciate that.
So pass the word on, soon
if you like it, tell your friends.
Exactly, and soon we'll have
give us a review on either talkshoe.com or on iTunes.
Yeah, we're always looking for reviews and stuff like that. So yeah, and neither Mark or I are much of a metal website message board surfers.
I just don't have the time. I'd love to, but it's something I don't have the time to do.
But if you're one of those diehards, certainly pop our name out there, because we're not doing this for cash or anything. We don't get paid. It's just sort of hey,
get out there and be a part. Being in the fanzine thing for 10 or 12 years. This is like the Web 2.0 version of of our metal journalism. So,
but if people like it, we're gonna keep doing it, and so far people have liked it, and things like that. So, but anyways, if you have a particular Carcass song that you love, and for a reason, let us know, and we'll give you a shout out in a future episode or something. But now we're gonna get to one of my choices, actually, from Necroticism, and I was sort of torn on this because this song, Carneous Cacoffiny, again a tongue twister.
Well, if anything, Carcass has made us work on our diction.
Yeah. Yeah, and certainly if you've ever taken the daunting task of trying to like you said, you used to do a lot of research. You'd crack a lot of books to try and figure out what some of the words meant on a lot of the Carcass.
Yeah, pre-internet, that was pretty fun to try to find these medical terms in a regular dictionary.
Yeah, to see if there was any metaphorical connection to some bigger social message, which most of the time there wasn't, but sometimes there was a few times. But this song, Carneous Cacophony, sort of bridges into Lavagine expectorate of lysergicide composition. Good God, where's Chris?
Or
when
that's
you need him?
Track 8?
Or track 7.
Track 7. Okay.
So 6 and 7 sort of bleed into each other, and I kind of had to choose one or the other. It was tough. It was like choosing between two children, but I chose Carneous Cacophony. So that's my choice from Necroticism. And then one of the songs you really were digging off, Tools from the Train.
Pyosified, or called Rotten to the Gore, which
it's a sequel, right? It's a sequel song.
Oh, there's still Rotten to the Gore. Actually, this is a re-recording of a song that was on Reek of Putrefaction, so it's more of a you can kind of tell what's going on a little bit more of this one.
It's got a nice energy to it, absolutely. Mm-hmm. And the Tools of Trade EP was put out after Necroticism.
I believe so.
Yeah. So Necroticism came out in 91, and then Tools of Trade, I think, is early 92. I think it's
92, yeah.
And then the Heartwork EP, which is where I'm going to play the next song, comes out
in 93.
Early 93.
And I think
Heartwork comes out late 93.
I think it was in maybe November, December, something like that, of 93.
Because I remember when Heartwork started... Heartwork was the first Carcass record my friends and I had really ever heard, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next talk set, but I think it was freshman year in high school, which was 93, 94 for me, and seeing the No Love Lost video and hearing Buried Dreams on the radio, and then of course Heartwork got heavy rotation, that video.
Well, that was, for those that don't know, that was the first deal they had. It was a joint deal with Earache and Columbia Records, when the Columbia Records basically picked up the entire Earache catalog, Godflesh, Entombed, Carcass,
Napalm Death, Fudge Tunnel,
Cathedral,
yeah. Now the Heartwork EP, which I'm going to play a song called Rotten Roll, and these are up until a few years ago when Wake Up and Smell the Carcass and
this stuff's all pretty easy to find. But before then, I think it was the only place I ever saw it. It could have been maybe an import, but I think like a radio single. I think Chris got it from like a bargain bin. Somebody at the radio station sold it back or something. So
that's pretty amazing. And
yeah,
the tunes are great. This Is Your Life and Rock and Roll, and I mean they fit right in with the sort of Heartwork aesthetic and sound and stuff. Was it probably promotional maybe to like because they were on Columbia now? Maybe it was just like an extra form of promotion.
It could have been. They did
something.
that with Cathedral too. They did a thing where you could send in like $1 or $2 and you could get this 7-inch. They had like the inebriated remix of a couple tracks or something.
Okay.
I mean that was a great time for Carcass merchandise, or as like promotional materials. Like they had the blood bag. They had like
which Chris Dick had the sweet blood bag for Heartwork. I remember
the Subway posters. I still have my Subway poster for Wolverine Blues and Tomb, which is pretty
huge.
Sweet. And I know doesn't Albert have the Heartwork Subway poster? He just got it from the guys from Carcass, like all autographed or something. Which is
lucky devil,
pretty crazy.
Lucky devil, Albert, if you're listening out there. But so anyways, Rock and Roll, song that I hadn't really heard until Wake Up and Smell the Carcass came out, because it threw the Heartwork EP on there as well as the Tools of the Trade EP. And I'm trying to remember, Wake Up and Smell the Carcass, I know it came out after Swansong.
Came out
96, 97, yeah. So, and of course I have the
censored. I got
censored
the full frontal
cover.
JFK blasted head.
Just in case if you ever want to see JFK's blown up brains,
not that you haven't seen it in still
in a CIA photo, hey, this is Carcass. So, but so we're gonna hear Carneous, Cacoffiny, and then one of Mark's picks, Pyosified, Rotten to the Gore, and then one of my picks from the Heartwork EP, not the full length, Rotten Roll.
Partly macerated, dissolved in a margarine container, which had engine coolant in it. They smelt very ordinary.
Sparking up my discordance on the jaw. Counter coffee, the best with bend. Exposed, decomposed. Your state's passion for human swine. Everyone invaded upon my bow. Usually incarcerated, legit listening. In a final death roll. Yeah, the violence has taken place. We're exquisite politics. The sex space below. And hardly with the deceased. My inspiration, yeah, this is regression. For my latest masterpiece. Yeah, my spark brings your fears. Blessings of genuine regret. That's all you'll be. Are you wait for your God on the void of the abyss of nothingness? Your usefulness is not true. Your productivity ain't been said.
Rotten Roll, Rotten to the Gore, and Carneous Cacoffiny on our favorite Heartwork show here. I noticed the rotten kind of theme running through all that. I don't know if we were inspired in some sort of way.
Subconsciously.
Yeah, subconsciously. But now we're going to get into our final set, which kind of gets into the I guess, controversial era of Carcass, where some fans start to scream sell out.
Every era of Carcass has been controversial to certain demographics of their their fan base. I mean, there's people that thought they sold out on Symphonies, for God's sake. So.
And it's, if you want a really good story about this whole sort of transition and people's outcries about each album, that issue of Decibel is almost like a narrative on that particular subject, where I think they interview some of the guys like Matt Harvey and some of the guys from some of the like Carcass tribute bands and
from like Exhume and stuff.
Yeah, and each of those guys kind of talks about like, this is my favorite record because, and I stopped listening to Carcass at this point because, and there's even a few people, I think some of the guys from At the Gates are big Swansong fans, which, we're a small brotherhood out there, but...
And, I know a lot of people that were not necessarily big death metal fans that loved that record.
It's the album Megadeth should have made after Rest in Peace. I've always said it's the greatest Megadeth record
if you took it out of context of Carcass's like lineage and you just threw it out there, it'd get like a 7 or 8 in a review.
I think so. It's lazy compared to Heartwork, but where
could you possibly go from there?
Yeah. I mean, Heartwork is so dynamic, and we're not even playing like the actual title track, which has some of the most unbelievable like soloing. Like, it's just one solo after another in the middle, and just the Ken Owens is right on top of everything with his drums. It's ridiculous. But anyways, I mean, Heartwork is near and dear to me, and I know obviously you're a huge fan.
Oh sure, yeah, that was the tour we saw him play on. That was the majority of what they played. It was unbelievable.
And Jeff and I saw or we didn't see, but we heard Buried Dreams, which is a song we're going to kind of open up our final set of music with. We heard this on some weird kind of night metal show that they used to do on Saturday nights.
On Z93.
On Z93, local.
Yeah, I about dropped a load when I heard that on the radio. I was like, you gotta be kidding me.
It was pretty nuts, and I remember, like, I think Jeff taped it or something, and then we kind of listened to it several times, and then right around that same time, that's when Heartwork got thrown on MTV Headbangers Ball. And the same guy that directed, his name is Tony Kuhnwalder, the guy that did the God of Emptiness and Rapture videos for Morbid Angel, did it. And
did No Love Lost?
I don't know if he did No Love Lost, but I know he did Heartwork video.
Okay.
So, and I just remember like the aesthetics of that, like you see them almost like doing the H.R. Geiger sculpture, they're building and stuff, and guys with like safety goggle things and like blowtorches and grinders. And then like I just remember Jeff Walker's hair kept flying backwards, and he's got a giant fan.
Like 1950s like headset, like he's should be driving a jet pilot or something.
Yeah, it was just a very, very cool era. And so Buried Dreams, the reason I chose it was it really is the first Carcass song I ever heard, and so it holds sort of special weight with me in my group of friends, because it's what sort of bridged us into the Carcass universe, I guess. And, I don't know who the first person was. I think it may have been Jeff that bought Heartwork first. I can't remember if it was on cassette tape or if we were in the CD realm at that point.
God, you'd hope it'd be on CD realm by 93, but...
Yeah, it's hard to say. We were sophomores in high school, so... And then a choice from Heartwork that you really loved, Blind Bleeding the Blind.
Yeah, which is, go back to Ken Owen again, is full of blasts and little triplets on his cymbal. It's just it's more of a reminiscent song to, at least the basic structure. It could have been off Necroticism. The solo is a little more dynamic, but it really kind of harkened back to that album, I think.
And I think the intro and the outro of the record is just, it's great, or not to the record, but to the song. It's like a solo trade-off back and forth, and... when they come out of the sort of blues riff into this like just super like melodic little, I don't know,
masturbatory solo.
It makes my toes twinkle a little bit and tingle a little bit, but it's a cool tune. And the thing is like, even like Heartwork has 10 tracks, and we were commenting like the 7th or 8th best song on that record would be like the best song on most metal records that are released nowadays. And you just don't hear albums with this sort of level of quality like Necroticism and Heartwork, where it's just from start to finish, just boom.
Yeah, Slaughter of the Soul. I can't even say that about Left Hand Path.
Yeah, I mean,
Left Hand Path's a solid record, but I'd say
there's a few songs that are very forgettable.
Like An Everflowing Stream is like a perfect record as well. But
it's really hard to make this kind of an achievement, and certainly Carcass was able to pull it off twice in a row. And
3 times, really.
Yeah, if you go from Symphonies all the way through.
Symphonies to Heartwork is like 3 flawless records almost of certain eras. I mean, you just look at their skill set and like what they came from. It's like that's like raising the bar 3 times in a row. Like that's why Swansong is looked at as a turd.
Which leads us to my last choice. I'm a Swansong defender. I didn't know any better. I was telling Mark this last week when we were kind of talking about some ideas for the show, and I just said, hey, like when Swansong came out, I had no basis of understanding of the history of Carcass, because I don't even think I had heard Necroticism at this point, and I may have heard Symphonies, but at that point I still thought Symphonies was kind of like humorous.
That you shouldn't listen.
Yeah, I didn't really know any better. So lo and behold, all I knew was Heartwork, and Heartwork, I loved the melodies and stuff, and I remember people who weren't really in the metal scene who liked Heartwork would always say, and I remember older people always saying, these guys are going to be maybe the next Metallica. And so it was almost expected that was the direction that they were maybe going to head into. I mean, I knew nothing about the band at that point. I didn't know the personalities of those guys and know that that's not what they wanted at all. Jeff Walker is a stubborn, SOB, and, he's not interested in being a rock star, or anything like that. So when this record came out, I just saw it. Like, it wasn't like something I was waiting for, but it was like I went into a record store. I'm like, oh, a new Carcass record. Grabbed it, went home, was like, this is a lot catchier than the last one. It's pretty stripped down, but
yeah.
We were.
Did you get that probably the year it came out, or?
Oh yeah, I mean, okay. I was probably a junior, sophomore in high school. Being
kind of like wrapped up in all the controversy around it, because I mean they recorded it for Columbia. It was shelved for like 2 years, so I was like, well, I guess we're not getting any more Carcass records, so I just kind of like left it at that, and I wasn't like betrayed by the record, but it was just like, okay, cool, at least I get this before they're done. So I wasn't a Carcass hater on this one either.
That's good. So you got two firm defenders of the quality of Swansong, which I'd say about, there's probably 8 or 9 good songs on this. There's probably 3 throwaway
like 50%
songs.
Good. 50% borderline great.
Yeah, and I mean they kind of continued the same sound, didn't they, with Black Star a little bit? Which is a record. Except
they throw some saxophone on there.
Do they? Ooh.
Rock and Roll Circus.
Oh, okay.
I mean, I just look at that record as like, well, I really dig, Ken Owen and Jeff Walker, so I'm going to follow whatever they do, and it's got a sense of humor to it. It's like, it is what it is. I'm not going to say it's a fantastic record, but it's a fun listen.
And you got to appreciate from maybe now from our perspective, where you're 12 years removed from Swansong. These guys don't put out much now. And so you got to appreciate
they've almost had more reissues and collections than they have proper, full length records. So they're getting to be like Jeff Buckley kind of stuff, where he's got one posthumous release and everything else is. I've got probably 25, 30 Jeff Buckley CDs.
Yeah, exactly. I have so many EPs and bootlegs and things from Buckley, and re-releases and things like that. And I feel like people who slagged on Swansong when it came out, that's fine, but the thing is you're never gonna get a new studio album, so that's all you got.
Yep.
Appreciate it for what it is. The fact that Jeff Walker's singing, yes, it's simplified lyrics, it's catchier, but Bill Steer's still playing guitar. Ken Owens is still rocking out some sweet drum beats. I mean, it's as, in the words of Jack Nicholson or whatever, it's as good as it gets. That's what you're gonna get. You're never gonna get Heartwork Part 2. You're not gonna get Necroticism Part 2. And so I think I take it from that.
Expectations of fans are so unrealistic at times. I mean, same with like not to go on a totally different tangent, but like the whole expectation of what was gonna come on the Star Wars prequels. Like I was like, well, if they're entertaining, fine. I don't hold them up to that level. It's just cool if we can maybe get another glimpse of this thing again. So
I feel like it's like comparing apples and oranges. You can't hold Swansong up to Necroticism. They don't balance.
They're different eras. I mean, you got to think that if a guy that was like 18 that wrote Symphonies, probably in their mid 20s, almost 30 when Swansong comes out, you got different things going on. Like I know that Steer was. He was way getting into more like blues kind of stuff. He's like, I've played this stuff forever. I want to challenge myself a little bit. And
how much faster and more technical can you get than Heartwork?
Yeah, like what the hell are you gonna do?
Besides, just get like 4 guitar players and just have like an orgy of guitars,
or you become arch enemy.
Yeah, I mean, really, in a way, and I think it speaks loudly to the reputation that Carcass had, I think, on Necroticism and Heartwork, that Arch Enemy has launched the way they have, because in many ways, Arch Enemy kind of took the torch of the Carcass sound, added a little bit more Swedish stuff into it,
but not that much.
But I mean, you listen to that first Arch Enemy record, Black Earth. That's a lot of people said, hey, that's what Carcass should have made after Heartwork in some ways, a record like that. But I take it for what it is. I mean, Mike Amott left after Heartwork, and that's what he decided to do. And he obviously had that sensibility because of his experiences in Heartwork. Mm-hmm. And God bless him for, Arch Enemy putting out some great records. But, I still take Swansong for what it is, an enjoyable record. So, I don't know. If you guys, are Swansong haters or Swansong lovers, just let us know. But in particular, I was sort of torn between 2 songs, Tomorrow Belongs to Nobody, which I've always loved because of the simplicity of the kind of political elements of the lyrics. And there's a lot of political things kind of going on. Rock the Vote, Go to Hell, which is the final song. It really appropriately should have closed our show out, because it's really Carcass holding a middle finger up to like their whole experience on Earache and Columbia Records and the whole debacle of like corporate rock. And it's there's a really tongue in cheek element to it. And in fact,
they've always had that. It's just gotten a little bit more to the forefront,
And I still have a poster in my room from Swansong, and it says, "This is the end. Corporate rock finally did it, killed Carcass and stuff." And I feel like, what? I'm glad I have that Swansong poster, because it does.
Well, it's cool. They kind of embraced that expectation of what people were going to think of this record too. It's like, well, this is all you're going to get. Here you go. If you hate it,
too bad.
Tough.
So we're going to close things out with Firm Hand, which has a lot of really cool dynamics and continues upon actually some of the kind of acoustic kind of orchestrations that Pedigree Butchery did on Necroticism, actually. Really. So it kind of ties some of the old and the new together. So hopefully you've enjoyed, our little foray into some of our favorite Carcass songs. Obviously, to give a proper history would take more time than we have. You could do
4 or 5 shows on these guys easily.
I think you could do a show per record.
Yeah, almost, I think all their records are incredibly worthwhile to explore all the way through. Each is a different little segment of who they are as a band. So
and it really represents a different era of extreme metal that was going on at that time.
I mean, like the sense of wonder you got looking at like a Symphonies of Sickness back in the day when nothing else was remotely like that at all.
And there were bands that really upped the extreme by the time Swansong or Heartwork came out in 94, 95. There were bands that had really gone way beyond where Symphonies was even.
Oh, yeah. I mean, because you got these people showing what's possible, and then these kids start learning younger and younger and younger, and just, like, the kind of stuff that they're putting out is like, like, the technicality is unreal, but it doesn't have that same kind of staying power that these first 4 Carcass records are going to have.
Which is, I think, why Carcass kept advancing. They just said, why go over territory we've already been in when there is going to be some younger band that's going to pick this up and do something way weirder with it than what we were going to able to do. So we'll just kind of keep moving along and kind of see where our sound goes. And obviously they hit their brick wall with Swansong, and that was about all they had in them. And I mean, for a short but sweet kind of career, I mean, the output that they were able to achieve is awesome, and there's definitely I don't think there's anyone
in the period from 1989 Reek, like this totally just raw, horrible sounding release to most people, and a couple years later they've got a record on Columbia that's spit and polished. I mean, that's progression. That's huge.
Absolutely. So with that, enjoy Buried Dreams, Blind Bleeding the Blind, and Firm Hand from our final set. So hopefully you've enjoyed some Carcass. I'm Jason Hundy.
And I'm Mark Rudolph.
Keep on rotting in the free world.
Difficulty
This episode is brought to you by Earache Records. For more information or to order any of the music you've just heard, visit earache.com. Available now is Deicide Scars of the Crucifix, Carcass Swansong, Digipack with DVD, and coming November 11th, Order of a Need.